By comparison, the West is different. From sheer size of the Western states to the economy that supports them, it's different out here. The people of the West were the first true stewards of the land, each having built a close relationship with it. America was founded on its ability to be self-sufficient. The West has always been uniquely positioned in providing the raw materials that led to our independence through ranching, farming, timber harvest, and other traditional land-based trades. Westerners have a multi-generational tradition of working in partnership with the land.
It goes back to our original founding era. You know, when the colonies first became states, there were great debates over what to do with the frontier lands, and Congress decided to allow those lands to be made into new states. And of course, before they were new states, they were federal territories. And once the states became states, they were all supposed to be treated equal under the law. And that's why those states then began to control the lands within their boundaries once they grew up and became an actual state. And in the West, the states are newer, we're younger, we haven't been around as long as those original states were. So we haven't got our land yet, but right now the states that were carved out of the Western federal territories are still controlled. I would say it's very close to 50% of every acre in the Western United States is actually owned by the federal government still to this day.
So why is it that the federal government owns it? So it's supposed to go back to the states. It has on the eastern and midwestern parts of the United States, but not the western parts. Why hasn't it gone back to the states?
Well, you know, I think that there's a lot of politics behind that, and there's a lot of control and power behind who owns the land. And there's some who have not honored the promise of statehood equality. The majority in Congress have just simply not honored the promise of statehood equality. In fact, there was a standing policy throughout our history of the federal government doing an action called disposing of the land. It's actually a term that's used in the U.S. Constitution. Under the Statehood Compact, when the states became states, there was an agreement that we're going to be a state, and we're coming into the United States on these terms and conditions. And it was called the Statehood Enabling Act. It was a federal act that the state agreed to. And as part of that act, there were actions taken to work out the ownership of the land and how it would be surveyed preparatory to disposing of it. And the state agreed that they wouldn't interfere with the federal government disposing of the land. That's all in our Statehood Enabling Act. So they worked this out back in, you know, when most of the Western states became states in the 1880s, late 1800s. But you know, by 1976, Congress came along and said, we're going to, you know, basically change the terms of that Statehood Compact, which was an agreement between the federal government and the state. And Congress said, we're changing the terms, and the states now are saying, wait a second, you can't, it's a contract between two parties. One party cannot change the terms of a contract. So Utah's been leading the charge on building the legal case, and hopefully we'll be bringing that before too long to actually get this question settled once and for all.
Why not let them own all this land? It's our federal government. It manages a lot of our national parks. Conservatives and Teddy Roosevelt generally, you know, started the national park system. We love the outdoors. Why not allow the federal government to control all this land? What are the problems with that?
Well, first of all, this movement that I'm working on with the American Lands Council to get the federal government to start transferring land to the states, we're not talking about the national parks. Those are a very, very small percentage of the actual federally controlled lands. It's the other lands that the federal government has kept that are supposed to be managed for multiple use and beneficial use. And the problem is that you've got 535 members of Congress, right? And you've got a very small proportion of them coming from the western states. So the eastern states dominate the decisions, they dominate the budget. And you've got people in the east that are basically making decisions that affect the daily lives and livelihoods in our environment, our air quality, our water quality, and all these factors. They're making those decisions without ever having even been here.
One of the harsh realities of the West is the challenges that come with the increasing intensity of wildfires in the summer months. What starts as a lightning strike or escape campfire can easily turn into a fire that causes complete devastation of the land.
So the left makes the argument that the reason we have forest fires is because of climate change. Is it climate change that's driving these forest fires, or is it mismanagement by federally owned lands, mismanaged by the federal government?
I don't think there's any one factor that you can point to, and people that say it's just climate change are not looking at the actual science of land management. Because when you are able to control the vegetation, reduce vegetation, you're reducing fuel loads on the landscape, and then you get fires that burn and they don't burn as hot. So they're easier for the firefighters to get in and control and put out. Grazing and logging are two excellent ways to reduce fire hazard while providing for livelihoods. You know, you can go in and thin the timber and take out some merchantable timber and put that timber into productive use that benefits mankind, and at the same time you're reducing the fire hazard and you're protecting the environment. So there's a real win-win combination that can work there.
We're really seeing a large increase in our rangeland fires now. You know, over in eastern Oregon, you can have a big fire that goes a lot of acres and it doesn't destroy a lot of trees, but it destroys a lot of foliage. One of those is we've had about a 30% decrease in leasing rights or leasing for cattle to graze. Now, when cattle graze land, it does keep the foliage down and keeps it less prone. We've had about an 80% on our federal lands from the 70s and 80s in timber harvest, so reduction. So we've had a huge reduction in timber harvest. What is happening, we are catching about 95% of most fire starts. But what's happening now is we're getting so crisp out there in the woods, then the 3 to 5% that get away, they become mega fires. And so I think that what we could really do to mitigate, you know, people say, well, can you really mitigate wildfire? I think absolutely that you can. If you look back at the 80s, at our timber harvest and our reduce in foliage out there, and then take some of the policies that have come in, you know, for environmental impact, I think that both of those sides can be successful. We need to look back at kind of how the Native Americans did it when they were here well before us. They had prescribed burns down to a science. And they were able to control that by burning the land, the wildlife and the buffalo and everything. We have reduced our grazing, and so I think there's a benefit that we're missing when we reduce the grazing. Now, we do want to take care of our lands, and then commercial thinning, we could do a lot more of that, where we go out and we leave the big, you know, my guys and I are working on one of those commercial thinning jobs right now. We go in and we take the smaller trees, we leave the big healthy trees, and those are spaced about 25 feet apart on average. And then we take everything that's 7 inches and below or above, you know, DBH, basically the height or the size of the tree at about this height, we take that out. And so if we had the investment of the hundreds and billions of dollars that we put into being reactive to these mega fires and reinvested that in being proactive, I think absolutely we could make a significant decrease in the mega fires that we're seeing today.
If you are actually out there managing a forest, and if the land's privately owned, there's a profit incentive for it not to burn down. So companies will maintain those forests to prevent forest fires. whereas the federal government has no incentive. And frankly, a lot of environmentalists get in the way to leave forests in their natural state, which unfortunately is a very high fire risk. The fact is, every year, people all across Western Oregon have to deal with smoke. I mean, it pollutes the air, it dumps thousands of tons of carbon into the atmosphere. I mean, not to mention it destroys people's homes, and of course, the lack of jobs and money coming into county government that gets destroyed every year from forest fires. And the worst part of the problem is they're getting progressively worse every year. I mean, this last fire season was probably the worst we've seen in 100 years. Of course, when a fire starts on a federal land, it spreads to private land as well, so it kind of ruins it for everybody.
One of the things that the cattle ranchers or anybody who has a ruminant that's out there grazing is going to be able to do is to get that load down. And what that fuel load does is that's what sparks and takes off in a wildfire. And that can stretch for acres and it can move fast. And so the big part and the big aspect of this is getting those animals out there is going to be tearing up the grass in a good way. That provides the opportunity for regenerative croplands to grow. That allows for the native grasses to take off. It gets rid of the invasive species. And then also just having people out there. I have a very firm belief that when you have people who are good stewards of the land and they're out there and they're looking at that land every day, they can turn in reports that we need to continue to make improvements on those lands for future generations and for the earth as a whole.
There was over-exploitation of resources in the past. There was very heavy industrial use. And that was back before we had a lot of environmental laws and we really understood how important it was to protect the lands. But now the pendulum has swung the other way and you've got this overprotection to the point where hands off, don't touch. And what you end up with is protect actually is the equivalent of neglect these days. And so when you neglect, look at what happens to your own garden if you neglect it. It's choked out by weeds, it goes to seed, it's not productive, it's not healthy. The forest basically is a garden. It's a very slow growing garden, and when it's tended properly, it can be highly productive. You can have much better wildlife habitat. You can have much less wildfire danger. You can have much cleaner water and cleaner air by managing your vegetation well.
If you go back even further than the 80s and you go back to the 50s and 70s era, I think we've seen a significant change in the amount of our fires that we saw back in the 80s to now as we're moving forward in the 2010, 2020 era. We're actually starting to see an increase in man-made fires. If you look at, I was looking at some statistics in Oregon for 2018, 65% of the fires that we had were man-made and about 35% were lightning strikes. If you look at Washington, 84% of theirs were man-made and 16% were lightning strikes. And so we're seeing more population out into the woods. That affects it. We're seeing some climate change as a bigger overall some warming, but I think the biggest change that has, and it's particularly pertinent this year, is less water. Regardless of property ownership, if the federal government is in control, and when we go out on fire, there's either a private landowner that has some control of how those resources get allocated to fight that fire, or there's a state, Oregon Department of Forestry controls how that gets, or there's a federal government. And the federal government, even though they have significant amount of resources, they're very sluggish to get on a fire. So when they are in control of an area that has a lightning strike, the probability is about double that is going to turn into a significant event. But if that same lightning strike was handled by the state of Oregon, which I think the Oregon Department of Forestry does a pretty good job, the probability is half. And so that's a policy decision, right? That's a reaction. The federal government certainly has the resources to have these airplanes that you hear going by here to be out there. An interesting approach is the private ownership here in Oregon. Weyerhaeuser is a fairly large private holding of timber. They have recon flights out every day during the fire season, regardless of a red flag warning. The federal government sends those resources out when there's a red flag warning or a lightning strike coming up. So they're looking for that 35% or that 14% in Oregon to be reactive to that if that happens. Now that's good that they do that, but they're missing the 65 or the 80% that came from human caused, where our private timber, they're like, you know, people are camping out there, right? And some people start fires when they shouldn't, or they don't put their campfire out. And that's by far more than 50% of our fires, if you look at that percentage-wise. And so the private industry is proactive on going out there and watching every day. They're proactive on their thinning. They're proactive on their forest management compared to the federal government. So basically what happened in the 70s and 80s is the federal government just decided, we're gonna let nature take its course. Well, nature is taking its course, but we don't have the Native Americans there to help nature clean out that foliage anymore, or we don't allow them. We have them, but we don't allow them to do that anymore. So that policy change has really created the sluggishness of the federal government to respond. You know, we will often sit with our low boys in staging for 3 or 4 days and watch this fire. Well, we're just making a plan. We're making a plan. And then it starts running. Where if it was a state or a private, that equipment would be in there a lot quicker. So there is a balance between 1950 and 2020. There's a balance here that when we were just kind of cusping over in the 70s, where we had some timber management, we had a lot less fires to shut everything down, particularly on the federal side. That's come home to roost. And if we don't correct it, we're going to see these mega fires for the next 10 or 20 years, or until we do correct it.
You know, there's a lot of hazards in firefighting in general, but once you start trying to fight fire in these large, tall stands of timber, it becomes very difficult, especially when the fire gets up into the canopies. You know, at that point, you almost lose control of the situation, and at times have to back off and wait for it to make its run before you can re-engage, just because there's so much energy that's being released at the time. You know, the other big thing that we see is the hazard trees out there. So, you know, throughout Western Oregon right now, we're seeing a lot of trees dying from drought and bugs and things like that. So when we get those large clumps of trees, trying to fight fire in areas like that can be very difficult just because of the hazardous situations. We're going to see the same thing in a lot of these large fire scars going forward. So there's a big mixture of what's happening post-fire between public lands and private lands. And you know, that's a debate that's above my area of expertise. But on the private side, we're seeing them go in a lot of times and taking out the trees they can salvage and reforesting, and you know, getting that back in a productive cycle. On the public land side of things, you know, they're trying to do what they can in terms of salvage or removal. But they're very limited based on what they can do on their forest management plans and things like that. And in those areas, you know, there's hundreds of thousand acres throughout Western Oregon that are going to be, or already are, left standing dead trees. And getting back into these areas to fight fire is going to be very challenging in the future, because now we have huge blocks of hazards. And, you know, as a firefighter, I can't send somebody into some of those places right now, let alone in 5 or 10 years from now when those things continue to deteriorate. So we're going to have to take different strategies and tactics in these areas going forward, and we're probably going to see aviation being a big key on that. These fires are a lot different than what we would see in just a grassy area or, you know, something like that. And the big difference there is the type of fuel and the amount of fuel. You know, we have, you know, thick duff layers of just organic material on top of the ground that will sit there and smolder for a long time if not properly extinguished. And then when you look at the large trees and the stumps and the root systems and everything else, you know, that stuff will get in there and sit there and smoke and smolder and burn. And you know, Archie Creek fire started last September, and we've had stuff that we've responded to out here over the winter and into the spring of 2021. And we'll probably continue into the summer of responding to smokes in this area. You know, those fire will get into small pockets and sit there and smolder for long periods of time.
So traditional land-based livelihoods like ranching, farming, forestry, these are actually very, very beneficial to our environment, to our water supply, and they were beneficial to settling this land as part of America in the first place. You know, it's just a very rich history that we have, a rich heritage that we have here that really a lot of the credit goes to the ranchers. It goes to the pioneers. It goes to the farmers that came out and made something of this land, actually made it into productive land. And in the old days, they were given grazing rights by the federal government. They would file for those rights and be able to have access to graze certain areas. And, you know, there's nothing more important to a rancher than having good forage for the livestock, and you've got to have that on a continuous basis. So the ranchers are really some of the very best stewards of the land because they know how to monitor their grazing and make sure that they're not overgrazing the landscape, and they rotate the cattle through, and by doing that they're actually helping improve the quality of the environment. They're out there to battle fires when they come through. They protect their watersheds. So I really, the ranchers are some of the best stewards of the land that you could possibly have.
Western lands are rich with rivers, valleys, mountains, lakes, grasslands, and deserts. Each climate is its own ecosystem that is called home by a large variety of wildlife. It is one of the things we love most about the Western states. It is our duty to manage our lands and wildlife species to ensure the health of the land. Sometimes, introduction and reintroduction of certain species is a practice that the government encourages in order to manage wildlife species. Wolves and grizzly bears are two of those species that are being reintroduced to the West.
What is the federal government doing on animal issues that's really affecting local livelihoods?
Well, the biggest travesty is that the federal government is using the Endangered Species Act as a tool to stop productivity and beneficial use of federal lands. And there's a lot of false science that's being used to push that.
One of the things that we can't handle right now is the wolf population, and it is way over the max allotment that the United States Fish and Wildlife have given them permits to be. And so what happens there is the cattle ranchers and the sheep producers and the goat herders, they're losing numbers of animals. And when you lose one animal, let's say one female cow, you're also losing that offspring, you're also losing the projected progeny from that animal, and that's years and years of value that factor into that for that rancher or that shepherd. They settle down to the valleys where they can prey upon calves and cows and the herds that are out there.
What is a lost cow to a rancher? What's the cost of that typically?
Well, it depends, you know, if it's your first, second calf heifer or something, you know, you're going to have for 10 more years, right? You know, what's the economic production of that cow over its lifetime, right? Mm-hmm. So it's really hard to put a number on. You can say, well, the cow's worth $1,600, right? Well, it's worth more than that to the rancher. And then you take, I saw it in my other career, so lion or bear on sheep, right? On a band of sheep. Well, yeah, it might kill a few, but what it does to the rancher, to the livestock producer is, so maybe he's used to coming off in the fall. He comes off in September with 120 to 130 pound lambs, right? Maybe that's his norm, okay? Well, you have a year where there's a lot of bear damage. The bears are in the sheep all the time, or the lion are in them. All of a sudden he's weaning a 110 pound or 115 pound lamb, you know? And over a couple thousand lambs, what's that to the person, to the livestock producer financially? It's huge. So sometimes it isn't just the number they kill, it's the effect they have on them because they're nervous. You know, when there's a lot of damage like that, sheep don't want to feed into the timber. You know why? That's where the bears are at. You know, they're not stupid. So they don't, maybe there's good grass, the best grass in the whole permit, right? The whole allotment is right there in those trees, but they don't want to go use it. So they've already seen that with wolves on cattle. You know, they stress them. You know, their weaning weights are down. Same way with, you know, with lambs, you know. Those weights are down. Weaning weights on cattle can be down because they're being harassed, you know, or the cow won't go to that particular part of the range or that particular part of the allotment. So there's all kinds of other impacts that are really hard to see. If it's a dead cow, okay, you go, yeah, it's a dead cow at this market is worth X amount of dollars, but there's also a lot of other loss.
Well, you know, I've always found it ironic that these people on the Front Range that voted for these wolves to come in would never spend $1,600 to feed a wolf, but they're fine if you spend $1,600 on the low end by giving up one of your cattle to feed a wolf. I mean, it's I don't think they thought through all the impact on this.
No, they haven't. You know, that's well said, because that's true. I will say that Prop 114 and the introduction of wolves into Colorado, you know, we're talking about the rural and urban divide. You couldn't have drove a bigger stake between rural and urban than introducing wolves. I can tell you that ballot box biology does not work. It never has, it never will. You know, let the wildlife professionals do their job. We saw it on the bears, you know, with Amendment 10. We've seen ballot box biology with trapping, Amendment 14. And none of those have worked out well. You got to go trap a wolf somewhere and take it from some other pack, haul it to Colorado and kick it out in a really unfamiliar territory. You know, that isn't even fair to the wolves, you know. We got rid of spring bear hunting with Amendment 10 here in Colorado. Can't use dogs and can't use bait for spring bears, you know. And that's just not a way. Let the wildlife professionals manage the wildlife, you know. And I can tell you that they're going to manage them to their best ability at the population level that they can manage to, and what the habitat will support. And we don't need to ballot telling us how to manage wildlife in this state or any other state.
The West is different. The West is very unique. And I'd like to see us be able to maintain that uniqueness, you know, maintain our freedom and not be one size fits all, not have Washington, D.C. control every inch of our states. You know, let each state be a state and express itself in the way that, you know, that really reflects the people that are in that state. That's one of the beauties of America. We're a patchwork of states, and every state is a little bit different. Every state brings something special, and that diversity is what makes America really, really unique as a country. So one size fits all isn't the answer, especially when it comes to our public lands, our environment. You know, and so you will see these laboratories of democracy actually start making a difference that helps. But the one-size-fails-all policies coming out of Washington, D.C. have been failing for decades. Nobody knows and cares about the land here more than the people that live here. Nobody cares about the air and the water more than the people that drink that water or breathe that air. So nowadays, the states are grown up. We are mature. We do have our own environmental laws. We do have our own land management agencies. You know, for every federal land management agency and every federal law that there is to protect the environment and to balance the resource use, those types of agencies are mirrored at the state level. They're doing that kind of work. The difference is that on the 40 million acres of state-owned public land, we're seeing much better results. And throughout Western America, there are over 40 million acres right now that are owned and managed by the states. Most of it was transferred from the federal government to the states. And the states are doing a phenomenal job taking care of it. Some of those lands are being used for economic productivity. Some of them are used for state parks. Some of them are wildlife management areas. We've got the same kind of variety, but we're doing it on a much more efficient scale, and we're doing it with a whole lot more accountability to the people that actually are affected by the management of the lands.
I think most people would look at this and say things are not getting better in the Western United States when it comes to land issues. So we do need to have a change. We need to have a new direction. We need to return this land back to states, back to communities that are closely connected there, to be able to provide that influence. The federal government running the show from thousands of miles away is leading to worse destruction. Is that what's happening out here?
It's not fair, it's not constitutional, and it's not working. So 3 major reasons why we really need to bring land management decisions closer to home where they belong.